Welcome to Accommodation Atlas. Today we have an incredibly exciting session. I'm going to be speaking with the incredible Aubrey, who is a disability expert and advocate of her many talents. She is an ethical business and technology executive with global experience, specializing in developing and scaling teams and processes equitably to achieve responsible growth. Through all her work, she seeks to question, reimagine, and redesign the systems and practices that surround us to ensure that all people can have equitable, motivating opportunities and build a better world. Please join for me and Aubrey talking all about accommodations.
You know how much I care about this topic, and I
Yeah.
think, I feel like where we are in the world, the number one thing is just normalizing them,
Yeah.
like just making people feel like they can ask for help.
Hmm.
Because I think that, or sorry, I hate using that word. Ask for specific support
Yeah.
is the language that I try to use, which anyway, we can get into that.
Yeah. Well,
Okay.
that was actually the first question that I had for you. So, when you
Okay.
think about like workplace accommodations, this term's just thrown around. Like what does that mean to you? What are workplace accommodations to you?
Okay, I have a spicy answer. I'm excited.
Amazing. Go for it.
Um, so I actually think disability accommodations, or we often call them disability accommodations, but I actually think it's important to point out that everyone has accommodations in the workplace, whether you're disabled or not. So in disability theory, we talk about everyone or no one is disabled. I tend to fall on the everyone is disabled, either contextually or at certain times, or it's kind of inevitable that we all become disabled. And so I think the idea that everyone receives accommodations, it's just that some people's accommodations are the default in the workplace is really important because what it means is I think, helps destigmatize the idea that some people might need different or specific supports in order to be successful. So it gets away from this really toxic idea that an accommodation is special treatment, as opposed to helping someone who has perhaps a less typical need or a less common specific need that they need to get addressed. So that's what I would say is an accommodation is just the specific support that someone with a slightly non-typical need gets in the workplace that helps level the playing field.
Hmm. I love that answer. It is so great, and it is true because I feel like there's so much of accommodations feeling or coming across like special treatment. It feels like there's a lot of pressure and like kind of intensity and like emotional hurdles that people have to go through to ask it. And so I love that answer of, actually everyone has these already. Some are just already more common, and then others may feel like less common.
Totally.
In your opinion, what do you feel like are the most common barriers to entry for people asking accommodations, and how do you think people can navigate through that?
So I think a lot of it is that a lot of workplaces don't have written policies for this or accessible policies. So it means that, so what we know in the US is that the ADA requires companies to provide reasonable accommodations. So your liability is actually about your requirement to provide it, not about whether you have a policy or not. Like this is not a thing you get to decide, it's a thing that you fucking do. But a lot of workplaces don't put a policy in place, so people don't understand what's needed, which is especially difficult if you're talking to someone with, say, executive functioning challenges, is that initiating tasks can be really challenging. And when those tasks are ambiguous or uncertain, that increases the load that's required to kind of get the startup energy. But I also think it's scary for people because I can tell you, as someone who's had accommodations in the workplace, even though I write policies, I encourage everyone to get them. It was still really difficult personally to ask. So I have empathy that, like, we're not asking people to do a trivial thing. So I think having a policy. Second, I think requiring a diagnosis or disclosure of disability in order to receive accommodation is actually both incredibly inappropriate, it's also unnecessary, and it puts up a lot of barriers for people. So in general, that's true because diagnosis can be very expensive, if not impossible to get. But then also folks from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, people of color, are more likely to experience barriers to diagnosis. And so you're actually creating a really unfair process by requiring that. Also, one of the things I was really proud of is that we were really clear with folks that they needed to focus on articulating the accommodation needed, not about what their particular disability was, and that we had really good discipline around giving people resources to help them brainstorm and figure out what they need. And then the last thing is making sure that the process is iterative. So if people believe that they ask for one thing and that's it, that's their only shot, it increases pressure. It makes it harder to speak up and ask. Or if someone knows that it's okay to experiment and to figure out what works for them, I think it makes it a less emotionally intimidating process, which increases the likelihood someone actually gets the support that they deserve.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. What advice do you have if someone's working at a place that doesn't have a policy, but they do need accommodations or want to pursue them?
Yeah, so I would say one, definitely check out Jan. So Jan is an incredible resource that kind of gives you ideas about your rights, but also helps you brainstorm and has kind of inspo options for what accommodations can be. I think if you're nervous, chat to other folks who have gotten accommodations, whether at your workplace or external, if you don't know about that, because obviously it can be kind of private. I
Mhm.
think it's also a good idea to write down or write a script for yourself about how you want to say it if you're worried about kind of tripping on your words, which I think is super normal. I did that. So if that makes you feel better, I kind of wrote out like, I'm happy to disclose my condition. Here's the reason that I need this accommodation. I'm willing to consider other options, and that helped me feel prepared, even though I knew that my boss was like disability inclusive, but I was still like struggling with it. So I think those can be really important things. If there's a disability or a neurodivergence ERG at your company, I think leaning on the community or leaning on an external community is really important. So you have folks to kind of process like what might be a big set of feelings. So yeah, that's what I would say is write it down, lean on your community, ask about a policy because a lot of times companies just haven't put it in place because no one's asked. So that can also be an impetus for bigger change.
Yeah. Yeah, love that. Also, I do feel like sometimes it's in the handbook and people just don't know. If it's
Totally.
not like publicly talked about or if there's not something more formal outside of that, which can be confusing unless you're like seeking it out yourself.
Totally. And I also think that it's really, really important to read your policy
Yeah.
because, and you should be, feel free to ask questions, but I think it's really important to read the policy because one of the I don't want to say funny, but I genuinely found it funny. At Culture Amp was a lot of times people would come to me and they would make a complaint about the accommodations policy that was inaccurate because they were basing it off of what is usually done or usually forgotten in accommodations policies. And we had been really intentional about all of the carve outs. So for things like, people would say, it's horrible that we don't have a menstrual leave policy. And we say, no, 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 we cover reproductive disabilities under accommodations. You don't need a diagnosis. Like we have a standard procedure for that that our HR team is aware of. And so things like that is just that I'm telling you that these things tend to not exist does not mean they don't exist at your company. So spend that 5 or 10 minutes doing a search yourself, I think can be really helpful and also grounding. And it means that you'll have probably a better interaction with your HR person as well, which I think, again, keeping this trying to be an easy process when it kind of inherently isn't or often isn't, I think is important.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. What advice do you have for going through the process, both doing it yourself and then also obviously spending so much time helping other people do it as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the biggest things is coming in and having done some pre-work about what potential accommodations you might want, I think can be some of the most valuable things. So, one of the, not that it's a requirement, but also recognizing that your HR person is actually not the appropriate support person to figure out what accommodations you need. So, really, really common that the process would take longer than it may be needed to because as HR, you and I worked on a lot of cases where we had to send our employee back to their care team. So whether that's a counselor, a therapist, a doctor, right? It's up to them to decide, or other disabled folks. Like it's for them to decide who their support community is. But as not experts in disability, important that we let HR people maintain that boundary of facilitating the process for you without necessarily doing psychological or medical work, which we're not qualified to provide that level of support. So I think that's it, is you basically skip that step. If you come in with at least an idea of what you want, then you can collaboratively work on how to get the support in place.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say that was my experience as well too. The biggest hurdle was helping people figure it out. And a number of conversations that I had is, okay, great, the process sounds great, but what do I request? And I felt like that's always kind of where we ran into the biggest challenges of how to help people determine what it is that they need or they want. That seemed to be the biggest hurdle.
Totally. And I think it can be really hard when someone is like, I think that asking for accommodations puts you in an inherently kind of vulnerable position. And
Mm.
so I take it as really serious, but I want to share this here so people understand the kind of HR perspective is that I care deeply about someone getting appropriate support and care. And I need to hold a boundary that even as someone who is, an expert in workplace disability inclusion, I do not consider myself qualified to provide what are often medical recommendations. And I don't do that because of what I see as the risk to that individual and their experience that like they could be harmed in some way because of my bad advice because I'm not appropriate. So I just want to share that ethic because sometimes it can feel like, oh, this person's being difficult or they're refusing to help me when it's actually about a duty of care for that employee.
Yeah, absolutely. And even Jan, I mean, I do love Jan. It's amazing, has so many resources. At the same time, if there are some examples that are provided for a certain condition, that's not going to work for every single person that
Right.
has that condition. That's why working with a healthcare provider is so important because some things might work for someone, they might not work for somebody else. And that tailored approach is super important. I'm
Yeah.
curious about the AI piece. Like, how do you see that fitting into all of this? Because you're becoming an expert in all of that now, which is
Yeah.
amazing.
So my corner of the internet is like the cross of AI and disability justice,
Love
where
it.
folks don't know I'm working on a master's in AI ethics and kind of disability, critical disability is one of my focus areas. So I think there's kind of two sides to the coin when it comes to AI. I think AI is really focused on productivity and efficiency right now, which I see as often like structurally ableist concepts. So the idea that someone's kind of value to the organization is determined by their productivity just inherently counts out a lot of disabled people who are episodically or chronically capacity constrained, but that doesn't mean they're not coming up with high impact, high value things that they're doing, right? So time is not necessarily correlated with impact. So I'm a little worried about what it does to the world when we focus on efficiency in the way that I think disabled folks are going to be especially negatively impacted. Um, I also see the other side of the coin. So there's interesting research that's come out of the Turing Institute that showed that for neurodivergent children, that generative AI and AI agents can actually function as assistive technologies that can help improve their learning outcomes, also for folks with learning differences. And so I haven't seen a ton of research kind of taking that insight from children and applying it to the workplace. And so I would say that I can be quite a cynic about AI because I think it's overhyped in terms of how great it is so far. I do think it's transformative, and I think there is an opportunity for researchers to better understand what are the conditions under which disabled workers feel empowered to use this technology to assist themselves in ways that are meaningfully supportive versus not. And so that's kind of what I'm going to be working on for my master's degree is answering that question of when is it a net good? And then trying to think through practically what does it mean to actually create those conditions for people to achieve that more often. So uh, I'll let you know in 2 years if I get there.
I have all the confidence in the world that you will get there. That's so awesome. I know we just talked about like not giving advice to people on specifically what accommodations that they should request, but are there some common ones that you have seen just an immediate impact? So like I can give an example. Having agendas that not only helps people that, may benefit from that from a disability, but that it benefits everybody. So I'm curious if there's common ones that you've seen or worked with people on that just would be a great starting place for people to think about.
Yeah, so I think another one is there's a lot of folks who are not auditory processors. And so I generally don't see the benefit in saying like every conversation needs to be transcribed, but I think
Mm,
things like, using, meeting transcripts or summaries can be useful, or, for managers that are giving any type of performance or feedback, to request that once that's given in person, that it's also followed up in writing. I think that's really low levels of work for a manager who should be preparing if they're giving especially constructive feedback. But that's one of the most successful things I've seen for folks, especially folks with executive functioning challenges, often autism and ADHD is where I see that. That's kind of the most common experiences that I've worked with in the accommodation space. So yeah, meeting agendas, asking for critical, tasks, timelines, and feedback to be written out. I also think support, especially for folks who are on very scheduled roles, for permission, if it's not already a flexible workplace, to time box.
mm,
Um, so I think for folks again who kind of have focus challenges, that time boxing can be really helpful. I also, quite frankly, like am just so anti the return to work mandate. And I think that like the most meaningful accommodation we've seen over the last 5 years is just like the mass work from home for at least a specific set of the population. And I worry about the lack of evidence about return to work and what that does for disabled workers' opportunities. So that's what I'd say is if you're running a company, like some people love being in the office, let them do that. But the reality is people can pretty reliably choose where they work best.
mhm.
And that location doesn't actually impact how great of a team member they are.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think the return to work is a really interesting one. Also, you're probably well aware of this, but the court case earlier this year with Tudor versus Whitehall really lowering that bar for accommodations that are going to help someone's role, and also knowing the undue hardship, right, which is the justification company use to not support or to not approve an accommodation, that bar is so high. I think that there's just a lot of opportunity for people to really pursue what environment, whether it be from home or working style, is going to best work for them because the bar to accommodations has legally been lowered in the US, which is a great thing.
Yeah. And there was a case here in Australia very recently where a bank tried to recall someone who had moved like 2 hours away from Sydney, and basically the I think it was the Fair Work Commission, so like
Mhm.
our equivalent of kind of the EEOC
Yeah.
or the NLRB, basically said like the bank had insufficient evidence to prove that like her job was better done in the office because she's like, like me,
Yeah.
keyboard warrior.
Yeah.
And so that was really interesting to see that the law is like really pushing businesses to not just say vibes, that you actually have to provide some justification. So I'm really optimistic about that, and that the law is kind of catching up to what I think is just kind of a quite simple and common sense reality that like we're in a different world, and especially when we're seeing major talent shortages. Like, I think that this is an easy way to expand your talent pool.
100%. I completely agree. Is there anything I did not ask you about that you think would
I
be
don't
important to share?
I don't think so. I feel like my favorite fact that I'll like close out with is it's from Jan, actually. But Jan talks about, I think it's like 54% of accommodations actually cost nothing to
Mhm.
implement. And so I think it's also important when you're a small business and you think, how could I possibly do this? That actually most of the things, like the examples that we've given, are actually not cost-based accommodations. Often it's small adjustments to someone's work style or work day or practices that are actually the most effective accommodations. And so recognizing that like this, even at Culture Amp, I track how much we spend every year and it's a rounding error in the budget, and we're a 1,000-person company.
Yeah,
So just to note that like doing this is often free, and I mean, you should do it for the right reasons, but even if it's just because you want as much productivity out of your workers as possible, we end up in the same place, which is provide great accommodations experiences for people.
absolutely. Ah, well, thank you so much. This has just been the best chatting with you again.
Oh
It's
my gosh. I mean, I'm always happy to see you, but to get to talk about one of my favorite topics, like dream way to start a Wednesday.
Well, there you have it. Thank you so much to Aubrey for sharing these amazing tips with us today. Appreciate you joining us here at Accommodation Atlas, and we'll see you next time for more great tips.